Welcome to a series of presentations produced by the Lebanon Historical Society. These presentations have been made over a period of years, and we have just begun recording them, archiving them, and making them available on YouTube. We are just beginning this process, so sometimes the slide quality or the movie quality may not be the finest, but we are working at improving. My name is Chuck Werth. I am the curator of the Lebanon Historical Society Museums and also the informal historian for the township of Lebanon. My interest in the topic of Lebanon, Wisconsin in the First World War goes back to 1971 when my father's cousin gave me the enemy alien cards that had been carried throughout the First World War by my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, Johann Friedrich Werth and Henrietta Brosch Werth. Later that same year, I visited great-grandfather Friedrich's last surviving cousin. At that point, she was nearly 100 years old. She revealed to me a family secret that had been guarded by the family since the time of the First World War. And after hearing that secret and seeing these enemy alien cards, I began to wonder just how many families in Lebanon harbored similar secrets. Upon America's entrance into the First World War, or the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war to save democracy, it went by so many names. America entered on April 6, 1917, and at that time, 97% of Lebanon's residents were German-speaking. About 40% of them had been born in one of the dozens of German states, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, city-states, and other small conglomerations that would come to comprise the Prussian Empire in 1879. While the majority of the German-speaking immigrants in Lebanon followed the path to U.S. citizenship, some of the immigrants, especially some of those from Pomerania, were reluctant to become citizens of the United States. As peasant farmers in Pomerania, they had been exploited badly by their native land. They were particularly fearful of compulsory military service. In 1917, approximately 90 Lebanon residents had not become American citizens by their choice. Another 360 had become naturalized citizens of the United States. However, as you will learn in the course of this presentation, the ultimate outcome was that in Lebanon, approximately 450 adults, non-citizen immigrants and naturalized citizens, by federal mandate, were referred to as enemy aliens. And automatically they were suspected of being spies, saboteurs, fifth columnists, slackers, and terrorists. Under the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI in 1976 released to the National Archives partial wartime records of the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Investigation, the American Protective League, and the Committee on Public Information. The records document vigilante activities supported by the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Investigation, and officially promoted by the Committee on Public Information. With only 50 agents, the Bureau of Investigation, which was the predecessor body of the FBI, and yes, J. Edgar Hoover was already active in the organization. That organization, with only 50 agents, was unable to follow up on the more than 1,000 tips per month that were coming in alleging subversive activities by German Americans, particularly by German Lutherans. The released documents prove conclusively that German American Lutheran ministers and lay people were systematically targeted by the government of the United States before, during, and immediately after the First World War. The American Protective League was an authorized investigation arm of the Department of Justice, serving under the Bureau of Investigation. Initially, it consisted of 250,000 badge-carrying, unscreened volunteers whose only qualification was the fact that they had 75 cents to buy a badge. So virulent was the anti-German bias that the chief investigative and prosecutorial apparatus of the United States relied almost entirely upon unsubstantiated rumors and petty gossip to surveil and probe the private lives of hundreds of thousands of German-speaking citizens of the United States. After the war, America's official propagandist, George Creel, who served as chairman of the Committee on Public Information, boldly and proudly proclaimed, quote, "Never was a country so thoroughly contra-espionaged. Not a pin dropped in the home of anyone with a foreign name, but that it rang like thunder in the inner ear of some listening sleuth." America's official propaganda department, the Committee on Public Information, and America's Justice Department discovered two sources who were more than happy to report suspected subversives. Those two sources were the Protestant clergy in America and local postmasters. Protestant clergy typically misunderstood and disdained the religious practices of Lutherans, while local postmasters were on the lookout for mail written in the distinctive German cursive script or bearing return addresses from suspicious places like Germantown, Pennsylvania, New Berlin, Wisconsin, Bismarck, North Dakota, and the like. Overzealous patriotic citizens and government agents combined forces to systematically repress German-speaking Lutherans. While on the one hand, the government grew dependent on these non-governmental sources to detect and report supposed German Lutheran subversives, the Committee on Public Information cultivated three non-governmental allies to become effective outlets for the spread of propaganda, to fuel public outrage against German Americans, and to encourage vigilante groups to attack German-speaking Lutherans. Local English-language newspapers were willing pawns, hungering for sensational stories that would sell papers. Protestant clergy and their parishioners happily spread the rumors about German spies and saboteurs in neighboring Lutheran congregations. And the disciples of Theodore Roosevelt, nested within the anti-foreigner nativist wing of the Republican Party, rapidly shared the steady stream of anti-German lies flowing from the Committee on Public Information. For years, the Watertown Daily Times had competed head-to-head with its German counterpart, the Watertown Weltbürger. With the advent of the war, the Times ramped up its anti-Germanism with sensational stories and sizzling editorials focusing on Lebanon and on other neighboring German-speaking communities. One headline proclaimed, "No flag salutes in town Lebanon." That appeared in a 1918 edition of the Times. Edgar Rabenhorst was a Lebanon resident who was killed in action in the war. At his burial on the Lebanon Baptist Cemetery, there was an altercation involving Lebanon men and members of the Watertown Council on Defense, an organization that was affiliated with the American Protective League. The Watertown Council on Defense and similar like-minded groups would appear at German-American events intending to frighten German-speaking people. Favorite targets of their vigilante activities were the funerals of German-American soldiers. The story goes on. Town of Lebanon men refused to salute the flag and became offensive in their talk when their refusal was criticized. The incident involved Edward Gates, Progressive Party candidate for the post of Dodge County Treasurer. It happened at a recent military funeral, so the story goes. The report indicates that Gates was in the cemetery when Rabenhorst's coffin was brought to the gravesite. Gates stood with his head covered, despite the fact that he was near other men, visitors to the community, who removed their hats. Not until a Watertown man requested Gates to remove his hat did he do so. The Watertown man who made the request was a member of Watertown's Council of Defense. Returning from the cemetery, Frank McCall and other members of the Watertown Council of Defense entered Moldenhauer's Tavern, which stood a short distance from the Lebanon Baptist Cemetery. According to the Times report, there was considerable loud talk, with Gates acting as spokesman for the Lebanon villagers. Gates asked McCall, "Did you come here to make a stink?" The account continues, his ire was aroused. Mr. McCall read the assembled villagers a story from the Watertown Daily Times about Lebanon residents voting for socialist peace candidates in recent elections. He went on to criticize native-born Americans who would stand at the graveside at a military funeral without removing their hats. Gates replied, "About saluting the flag, we will do as we please." End of quote. The story goes on. Hot words continued to be exchanged. McCall feared for his life until another Watertown man removed his coat and vest, laid them on the pool table, and announced that he backed up everything that McCall had said, and that if he was not able to settle the matter, a number of state guard reserves were waiting outside. End of quote. The story concludes, McCall with other members of the group issued from the front door without molestation. For the duration of the war, from April 1917 until November 1918, the Watertown Daily Times regularly published articles about Lebanon and other surrounding German-speaking rural communities, which raised suspicions about the loyalty of German-speaking Lutheran citizens in the area, and the newspaper issued frequent warnings to those communities. Frank McCall read from this Daily Times story, which had been published a few weeks before the Rabenhorst funeral. And he read the story to question the loyalty of the residents of the town of Lebanon. The headline read, "Town of Lebanon sets new record. lightning changes in 4 years. Lebanon seems to have captured all records in their ability to turn overwhelmingly socialist and progressive in successive elections, the story goes. All this with no change in population other than those occasioned by births, deaths, and marriages. Lebanon is a very old and well-established community. It is likewise a very rich farming district. The town supports 3 Lutheran churches and parochial schools. Not so many years ago, German was the only language taught in the schools. There are many old men in the town of Lebanon, and some not so very old, who were born in the town and have lived there all their lives, but who cannot carry on even the most simple business conversation in any but the German language. The German Lutheran ministers have not taken the pro-American stand that our Lutheran ministers here in Watertown have taken. Not long ago, a Lutheran chaplain from Camp Grant, Illinois, spoke at Lebanon under the auspices of the County Council on Defense. The 3 German Lutheran ministers were extended particular invitations to be present, and the meetings were well advertised. The chaplain, who drew big crowds when he spoke in Jefferson County and elsewhere in the state, drew an audience in Lebanon of 9 men and a handful of women and children, and none of the Lutheran ministers, the story goes on. In the 4th Liberty Loan Drive, the town was assigned a quota of $80,000. That would be the equivalent of $1.4 million in 2017 dollars. The subscriptions that day totaled 43,900, or the equivalent of $775,000 in 2017 dollars, less than 55% of the assigned amount. The Watertown Daily Times printed stories that carried implied threats. One story reads, Christian Wolin, application for United States citizenship was denied by Circuit Court Judge George Grimm. Quote, the applicant has been a resident of the United States for about 20 years and is worth about $14,000. That's $248,000 in 2017. Wolin has never contributed a cent to the Red Cross, the YMCA, or other war charities. He has never purchased a Liberty Bond, but is the proud possessor of 1 war savings stamp. The cost was 25 cents in 1918. Because of this record, Judge Grimm concluded that Wolin's sympathies with America were not sufficiently strong to warrant the granting of citizenship. The Times goes on to say, our German Lutheran neighbors have been stiff-necked and hard to convince. Told that America would look with disfavor upon them in coming years, particularly when the boys come home, they refuse to believe. Arrogant in their beliefs, they see no chance that their records will be used against them. But they will be, the Daily Times warns. On the left, you will see the infamous sedition map, which was published by the Wisconsin Loyalty League to point out where disloyalty in Wisconsin centers. Along with that map, the Watertown Daily Times published editorials warning the Lebanon community and surrounding communities. Quote, citizens of German birth and extraction in our region do not appear to be entirely convinced yet that no duality of allegiance will be tolerated in the United States. The quicker the last vestiges of Deutschtum is eliminated from our area, the better for all concerned. They realize that Germany is doomed to defeat. They now desire to break Germany's fall by way of peace talks. They want to save the empire so someday it may try again. They apparently think that if they can get the president to act as a fender or firewall, the Hohenzollerns, the military caste, Kultur, and everything that has made the German system so odious to civilization can be saved. They say they want an honorable peace. That is, a peace which would allow Germany to escape the full consequences of her deeds. The Times concludes, the war will not be entirely or happily over for the United States until Prussianism shall be crushed within Germany's borders as well as within our borders. The single most effective American propaganda tool in support of America's entry into the war and America's recruitment for the war effort was the Protestant churches in the United States. During the course of the war, the notion of America as the chosen nation evolved into a full-blown ideology that captured the popular imagination. The war exacerbated existing tensions that existed between American Protestant church bodies and the ethnic Lutherans, particularly German-speaking Lutheran bodies in the Midwest. Except for the assimilated Eastern Lutherans, whose roots went back to 1664, the more recent German immigrant Lutheran churches like the Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, the Buffalo Synod, the Ohio Synod, the Iowa Synod, the Texas Synod, all maintained strong cultural unity based on pride in German accomplishments and a vigorous German language press. The earmarks of the evangelical empire were inconsistent with German Lutheran tenets. There was a persistent conflict between Lutherans and the dominant Yankee cultural values that had driven America since the arrival of the Puritans. American Protestants, including Eastern Lutherans, envisioned an evangelical empire and a nation of behaviors. This evangelical empire was required to legislate morality, to purge the world of sin, to rid the nation of the scourge of alcohol, to stamp out gambling, and to enforce strict observance of the Sabbath, called Sabbatarianism, which required all businesses to be closed on Sundays, forbade recreational activities on Sundays like playing baseball, and imposed strict church attendance standards for everyone. The evangelical empire was determined to reform the sinner, using violence if necessary, according to Presbyterian minister John Marcus, who proclaimed in a 1917 sermon, quote, "It is the business of religion to make the world a dangerous place for evil and evildoers," end of quote. John Marcus again preached a sermon in 1917 and declared what became the accepted truth. Quote, "The kingdom of God is the American nation with a law book that will live up to all of God's holy and righteous demands," end of quote. This declaration was embraced by proponents of the evangelical empire. To ensure that the evangelical empire would thrive, it was decreed that the public school system is to inculcate a Protestant evangelical consciousness, which is the true American Christianity, in the younger generation. With this underpinning, the logical conclusion was drawn. America is God's chosen nation, and going to war with Germany is God's plan. to make the world safe for Christian democracy. Going to war will reform and uplift the German infidel because that became a war cry. Of course, this included the German infidels living in America in their German-speaking Lutheran enclaves like Lebanon, Wisconsin. The United States government, through the Committee on Public Information, published informational pamphlets, sermons, and prayers for use in what were designated patriotic congregations. Quote, God's holy and righteous demands call for a crusade to civilize Europe and to defend and spread democracy, the holiest form of government. The war is an opportunity to reform not only American society, but the world. Thus wrote Reverend W.T. Manning in a pamphlet circulated by the Committee on Public Information, an official government agency called The Present Crisis in the Nation's Life. The Reverend Manning continued, quote, Our moral sense as a nation is dulled. Morally, we have lost our way. Our present lack of a national spirit is due, in part, to a vast amount of well-meant but mistaken and really unchristian teaching about peace. End of quote. Another Committee on Public Information pamphlet authored by the Reverend L.G. Boughton, entitled, Is Preparedness for War Unchristian? It was stated without reservation, quote, Democracy is Christianity in government, and democracy is Christ proclaiming universal brotherhood. The war must be a religious crusade to bring democracy and Christ to the world. End of quote. The evangelical empire became a driving force in the national machinery of repression and propaganda. The machine engaged two operational systems: groups with non-government sponsorship, NGOs, and recognized government-sponsored organization. We will look first at the groups with no government sponsorship, or NGOs. Loyalty leagues were groups of citizens who spied on other citizens thought to have connections with the German Kaiser. For example, someone with a German last name. They wanted to rid the country of all disloyal people. They spied on and reported neighbors, friends, and even family members. There are many incidents where children tattled on their parents, casting suspicion on their loyalty. As noted earlier, they were particularly adept at disrupting the funerals of soldiers with German names, as the Watertown group did at the funeral of Edgar Rabenhorst in Lebanon. The American Defense Society was founded in 1915 with the stated objective that every German American, quote, unless known by years of association to be absolutely loyal, should be treated as a potential spy, end of quote. Its first honorary president was former United States President Theodore Roosevelt, who was virulently anti-immigrant, pro-war, and a believer in America's destiny to colonize the world and bring Christian civilization to the rest of humanity. This group called for halting all immigration of anyone other than English-speaking people, and favored internment of enemy aliens, in which case 40% of Lebanon's population would have been interred in concentration camps. The American Defense Society literature opined, quote, "The appalling and complete breakdown of German Kultur compels a sweeping revision of the attitude of civilized nations and individuals toward the German language, literature, and science. The close scrutiny of German thought induced by Hun frightfulness in this war has revealed abhorrent qualities hitherto unknown and to most people unsuspected. Hereafter, throughout every English-speaking country on the globe, the German language will be a dead language. Out with it forever." The National Security League was also active in Watertown. It called for the closing of all parochial schools, insisted on the use of the public school system to indoctrinate children in what they called 100% Americanism, and by teaching what they determined to be, quote, "pure history," end of quote. They favored elimination of the teaching of all foreign languages and would require teachers to, quote, "focus on strengthening American manhood," end of quote. In other words, teachers were expected to weed out religious or political dissenters. They were to be on the lookout for sexual deviance. Local leaders would then be expected to crack down on those who frequented prostitutes, ex-convicts, and immigrants. The right to vote should be taken away from the general population through the creation of an elite meritocracy responsible for all decision-making. The second group were the government-sponsored organizations. The American Protective League was a massive government-sponsored and supported network of over 250,000 untrained volunteers. They operated under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, received their marching orders from the Bureau of Investigation, and were supplied with printed materials and propaganda by the Committee on Public Information. This unholy trinity of government propaganda through the Committee on Public Information, law enforcement officials in the Bureau of Investigation, and the untrained volunteers of the American Protective League became the most powerful and dangerous hate-mongering organization of the First World War. It was judged by many to be more frightening and more of a threat to American liberty than the entire German army. This chapter in American history is populated with shadowy figures, anonymous tipsters, gossip-wielding bullies, and powerfully effective rabble-rousers. The American Protective League was formed with the, quote, "fictitious knowledge of how widespread and unscrupulous was the German spy system and how seriously it was affecting the temper and loyalty of aliens and naturalized citizens," end of quote. It had two stated functions, and pay attention to these because this will become important as we move along. They were to make prompt and reliable reports of all disloyal or enemy activities and of all infraction or evasion of the War Code of the United States. And they were to make prompt and thorough investigations of all matters referred to it by the Department of Justice. Recall that this is a body of 250,000 untrained volunteers who had the 75 cents with which to purchase a badge and the aptitude to fill out an application. There was no background checking of any kind. The directives to the American Protective League were issued by the Department of Justice. The directives were created to encourage suspicion and mistrust. For example, quote, "There are 2 million men of German blood inside our borders, guaranteed by the Kaiser to be loyal to Germany," end of quote. or, quote, the adjectives German, pacifist, radical, and wide-eyed anarchist are all synonymous, end of quote. The Committee on Public Information fed the members of the American Protective League with propaganda designed to incite action against German-speaking Lutherans. They recruited Protestant clergy to prepare sermons, prayers, and Liberty Bond fundraising materials that were to be used in all of America's churches. One prayer submitted by a Minnesota Methodist implored, quote, "Dear Lord, deliver us from the hyphenated American, the pro-German, the spy, the profiteer, the pacifist, the slacker, and all who would retard the prosecution of the war for human rights, human happiness, in the establishment of a permanent and worldwide peace for Christ's sake. Amen." The directives were created to encourage violence. A Presbyterian minister prepared a sermon for a Liberty Sunday, which was to be used by all ministers of all denominations in every church in the United States. Quote, "It is God who has summoned us to this war. It is his war we are fighting. This conflict is indeed a crusade, the greatest in history, the holiest. It is in the profoundest and truest sense a holy war. Yes, it is Christ, the King of righteousness, who calls us to grapple in deadly strife with this unholy and blasphemous power." End of quote. A Methodist urged on by the American Protective League, "If there is any preacher who doesn't see his way clear to espouse the cause of the Allies, if we can't regenerate him, we will eliminate him and then turn him over to the Department of Justice." According to an official memo from the Department of Justice to the Bureau of Investigation and the American Protective League, quote, "Lutherans are the worst offenders," end of quote. The Lutheran pulpit is a recognized part of the German system of spy work in America. It is not fair to accuse all Lutheran ministers of desecrating the cloth they wear. There are good Lutheran ministers who are loyal Americans without question, namely the fully Americanized Lutherans in the eastern United States. At the same time, it is true that more charges have been brought against ministers of the Lutheran Church, and charges more specific in nature than any other class of profession in the country, especially in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Nebraska. These are so numerous that one cannot avoid calling the Lutheran pulpit in America the most active and poisonous influence existing in America during the war. That was an official pronouncement from the United States government. Allegations against Lutheran ministers made to the Department of Justice by Protestant clergymen included outrageous claims. Lutheran ministers swear allegiance to the Kaiser as part of their ordination vows. Lutheran churches receive direct funding from the German government. Reportedly, this was coming by way of an under the Atlantic Ocean pneumatic tube, delivering bundles of cash somewhere on the east coast of America. The Bureau of Investigation, FBI, thoroughly searched the coastline of on the Atlantic seaboard, looking for this pipeline of cash, which was flooding German Lutheran churches. German Lutheran churches were also suspected of harboring large caches of weapons and incendiary devices so that they could participate in the overthrow of the American government. Lutheran church bells ring shortly after a German victory in battle. Lutheran ministers gather frequently for pro-German meetings. You must remember that in 1918, the German Lutheran synods in the United States still conducted all their business and theological discussions in German. So yes, they were at meetings where German was spoken. Lutheran parochial schools are pan-German training academies. And the most scurrilous of all, the German Bible demands allegiance to the German Kaiser. And they would quote Matthew 22, 20 to 21 in the original, in the German language, which said, Und sprach zu ihnen, was ist das Bild und die Überschrift? Sie sprachen zu ihm, des Kaisers. Da sprach zu ihnen, so gebet dem Kaisers, was des Kaisers ist, und Gott, was Gottes ist. In English, then he said to them, whose head and whose title is on the coin? And they answered, the emperor's, the Kaiser in German. Then he said to them, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Parochial schools are the hotbeds of Kaiserism, proclaimed the Committee on Public Information, inflaming the members of the American Protective League. The evidences of this pan-German program, a definite part of Germany's higher strategy, are writ large over the parochial schools. The German parochial school bars patriotism. Such schools are under the domination of the German ministers in the community, and they are programmed to the core and espouse the cause of Kaiserism in a secret and cowardly manner, which makes it all the harder to neutralize. Pupils in the German parochial schools foster little Germanys. This opinion was widely held in Watertown, even among some Germans, those Germans who were called the 48ers, refugees from the 1848 aborted revolution in Germany. They held strongly anti-religious views and strongly opposed Lutheran parochial schools. While the chief target were Lutherans, Roman Catholicism was also suspect. Emigration from the old world has poured in upon us in hordes, papal and infidel propagandists. Their influx corrupts morality and Christianity among us. You see a cartoon there where government officials are calling for the time to finish off the Catholics. Midwestern Lutherans, which were predominantly German-speaking, were an enigma to American mainline Protestants. The continued use of the German language, Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, and the inscrutable synodical stands on unionism perplexed and infuriated Protestant clergy and laity alike. German Lutherans believed that the only way true theology could be communicated was through the German language and the Latin language. So they hung on to the German language because they believed it was the only way to preserve the purity of their faith. While the United States has always professed a cautious separation of civil and religious matters, the truth is that since the days of the Puritans, there has existed a civil religion in America. Calvinism is the foundation of the evangelical empire, and it had created a nation of behaviors through legal constraints and restrictions. Furthermore, by 1917, it was obvious that prohibition, the capstone of America's civil religion, was going to become the law of the land, and another way to enforce the Puritan values inherent in the evangelical empire. With that background, it's easy to see why Protestants simply could not understand that Lutherans truly believed and practiced a strict separation of church and state. To the frustration of many Americans, German Lutherans of the Wisconsin Synod, Ohio Synod, Iowa Synod, Buffalo Synod, Texas Synod, and Missouri Synod became infamous among the Protestant churches in America for their steadfastness in their ethnic, cultural, and religious nature. In an age of increasing pressure for church bodies to unite, the German Lutherans held doctrines that prohibited cooperation with non-Lutherans. German Lutherans were viewed as exceedingly idealistic, unrealistic, and impractical. Because American Protestantism did not understand the Lutheran position, they determined that German Lutherans were radical fifth columnists, intent upon bringing German rule to the United States. Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms taught that there is an absolute separation of church and state. The practical implications meant that German Lutheran congregations should not be coerced into promoting Liberty Bond rallies. No national flags were permitted to be displayed in church buildings. Midwestern Lutherans avoided election to political office and practiced political quietism, calm acceptance of things as they are without attempting to resist or change them. Let the government do what it must, but the church must avoid involvement. The other conundrum for American Protestants was the Midwestern Lutheran doctrine of fellowship, cooperation, involvement with other Christians. The doctrine maintains that religious unionism consists in joint worship and work of those not united in doctrine. Its essence is an agreement to disagree. In effect, it denies the doctrine of the clearness of Scripture. So Midwestern Lutherans, to a greater or lesser degree in 1918, adhered to what is called the unit concept or unit principle of fellowship, which places virtually all joint expressions of the Christian faith on the same level. The practical implications of which meant no joint prayer with any individual, either privately or corporately, with whom you had any difference of opinion or a difference in doctrine. Therefore, two people who were not absolutely in total agreement could not pray together. That meant even Eastern Lutherans and Midwestern Lutherans could not pray together or cooperate, even at a table prayer over dinner. Naturally, this kind of prohibition against joint religious activity precluded participation in ecumenical services or bond rallies or joint services promoted by the Committee on Public Information. Pastors were not permitted to use sermons and service materials distributed by the Committee on Public Information. Congregations could not publicly endorse bond rallies, and church funds most certainly could not be used to purchase Liberty bonds. You will recall that the Department of Justice promised that its draconian proposals were intended to promote prompt and reliable reporting of suspected subversive activity and prompt and thorough investigation of those reports. Let's see how well that worked. While we have no record of what happened in Lebanon, each of the incidents cited here involved German Lutheran communities in the Midwest, and our Lutheran ancestors were very aware of all these events. Put yourself in their shoes and imagine what went through their minds every time they heard about another incident of violence against German Lutherans. Robert Paul Prager was a German coal miner living in Collinsville, Illinois. He was lynched by a mob. 12 men were tried for his murder, but were subsequently acquitted. Prager was killed because of anti-German sentiment during the First World War and because he was accused of holding socialist beliefs. Other incidents stopped short of murder. On October 20th, 1918, John Demmel, a farmer in Outagamie County, Wisconsin, which was a heavily German and Scandinavian area, was visited by a nativist mob. Suspected of not strongly enough supporting the war effort, he was narrowly saved from lynching. The mob settled for, quote, beating and bloodying him, end of quote. Tar and feather parties were common in German Lutheran communities. Yellow paint on Lutheran churches, on parsonages, on parochial schools, and the headstones of Lutheran cemeteries became the most common mark placed upon those suspected of disloyalty. In a community near Lebanon, a bond slacker, someone who wasn't buying enough war bonds, was taken from her home, placed in an animal cage, and hauled up and down the main street of the village. Back in those days, they published who bought war bonds and how much. Recall the man in Lake Mills whose citizenship was denied because a public record showed he hadn't bought enough war bonds. A nearby minister and his wife were beaten because the minister preached in German. In nearby states, 2 Lutheran schools were burned to the ground, and another one was dynamited. A Lutheran teacher was instructing students when a bullet was fired through the window of his classroom. No one was injured. Members of the American Protective League routinely interrogated adolescents about what they were being taught by their German-speaking Lutheran pastors in confirmation instruction classes. Agents of the American Protective League visited Lutheran churches and asked for English copies of sermons, German sermons, to determine their adequacy in support of the righteous cause. German Bibles and copies of Luther's Small Catechism in German were regularly confiscated and burned. Emil Dornfeld was a Lutheran minister born and raised in Lebanon. His father, Ernst Gottlieb Dornfeld, was one of the primary figures in the founding of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Sugar Island. Reverend Dornfeld served St. Paul's Church in Marshall, Wisconsin during the time of World War I. Dornfeld received a phone call from someone claiming to be a reporter for the Milwaukee Free Press, which was a publication favoring peace and neutrality and supportive of Wisconsin's Senator Robert La Follette. The caller asked Dornfeld how he felt about La Follette's stand against the declaration of war. And at that time, about 75% of Wisconsin voters agreed with La Follette's position. Dornfeld replied, "There should be more men like him," end of quote. Dornfeld refused to divulge any personal information, and the caller then hung up. Actually, the phone call had been made by a volunteer of the American Protective League. The agent reported to the Department of Justice that he had enough evidence to make a personal visit on Dornfeld. The agent's first stop was the U.S. Post Office in Marshall, Wisconsin, a standard procedure for American Protective League agents, and there attempted to determine what kinds of mail Dornfeld was receiving, in what language, and to whom Dornfeld was sending mail, and in what language. The postmaster, of course, cooperated. The postmaster indicated that Dornfeld received, quote, "a great many letters from Milwaukee and other towns in Wisconsin," end of quote. The agent instructed the postmaster to reroute all suspicious mailings to Special Agent Fitch of the Department of Justice. The postmaster also reported to the agent that Dornfeld, quote, "will not attend Memorial Day exercises or graduation exercises in the public high school, and has not done so in the past, although each year he has been extended an invitation." Recall, this is a Wisconsin synod pastor who was not permitted by his synod to participate in such activities. The agent reported forthwith to the Justice Department that, quote, "this case will require further investigation," end of quote, and reminded the postmaster not to alert any other people in the community about the ongoing investigation. Dornfeld was never incarcerated, prosecuted, or charged with anything. Other Lutheran ministers endured prolonged investigations and prosecution, always ending in exoneration. A Wells minister in Ohio spent months in prison, was not fully exonerated until years after the war, and to pursue his defense was forced to expend the equivalent of $1.5 million in 2017 dollars, money that was provided by his congregation and neighboring congregations. No Lutheran minister was left with a criminal record at the end of the war. If convicted, the convictions were always overturned on appeal. You will recall that I began this presentation suggesting there has been a well-guarded secret within the Werth family related to the First World War. That secret involves my great-grandparents, Friedrich and Henrietta Werth. Johann Friedrich Werth, he preferred to be called Friedrich, was my great-grandfather. He came to America in 1868 expressly to avoid conscription into the army of the Kingdom of Prussia. He was no fan of Kaiser Wilhelm, the first or second. By the age of 23, Friedrich had witnessed the devastating wars of acquisition that were waged by the Kaiser, the Hohenzollern monarchs. The Second Schleswig War, the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Because Friedrich's father, Michael Werth Jr., was an itinerant laborer, and since Friedrich was his only son, Friedrich had been able to avoid conscription. Michael, his father, in his youth, had maimed himself by cutting off part of one foot with an axe in order to avoid conscription into the despised army of the Kingdom of Prussia, who held Pomerania in unwilling thrall in those days. In 1867, the North German Confederation was created, and it became painfully obvious to Michael that his young son Friedrich would not be able to avoid the looming Franco-Prussian War, which broke out in 1871. Michael did not want his son Friedrich to end up having to maim himself as he had done, and so the family emigrated to America. Keep in mind, the motivation for their emigration was their loathing of the Prussian autocracy, their loathing of Kaiser Wilhelm. That point makes the story even more distressing. Like 79 other Lebanon immigrants, Friedrich did not file for citizenship. He arrived in America 3 years after the end of the Civil War, and there were still stories about how Germans had been pressed into service against their will in the American Civil War. Stories about unscrupulous military conscription were rampant. Fearful of facing another possibility of enforced military service, Friedrich simply did not apply for citizenship, something that went on commonly among German immigrants. Friedrich purchased 40 acres of land near Sugar Island. In 1874, he married Henrietta Brosh, a native-born American citizen. Friedrich and Henrietta reared 4 children and for 37 years lived a contented life. Then on April 6, 1917, the United States Congress declared war on the German Empire. In February of 1918, both were required to register as aliens and became Friedrich had to require as an enemy alien. You will notice on his registration card. He applied for citizenship and became a citizen of the United States on April 11, 1918. However, until the end of the war, he was required to carry his enemy alien card. If one of President Wilson's proposals had passed Congress, Friedrich either would have been confined in an internment camp or more likely deported to Brazil or Argentina. Married for almost 37 years, this governmental intrusion into their lives severely damaged the final 20 years of their marriage. Henrietta became bitter and angry. Born a citizen of the United States, she never overcame the stigma and shame she felt because she married Friedrich and was therefore labeled an alien. Note, she was not identified as an enemy alien, as was Friedrich. Nonetheless, her marriage to Friedrich made her an alien. She began to physically abuse her husband. Her grandchildren noted that the loving grandma they once knew became shrewish and temperamental. She felt betrayed and abandoned by her homeland, and she blamed her husband. Friedrich was a poet who regularly wrote about my beautiful Lebanon, meine schöne Lebanon. So he states in his pre-war poetry. That joy and pride is missing in the verses that he penned after the war. While he continued to delight in his family and celebrated his Christian faith, the sparkle and luster of his adopted home was gone. He became much more concerned about death and heaven and less interested in the affairs of daily life. Through the course of my research, I've come to identify very closely with the plight of aliens and immigrants in America today. Between 1914 and 1920, my ancestors and many of the residents of Lebanon, even today, were subjected to unwarranted intrusions into their civil liberties. Their private lives were made into ludicrous public spectacles. Their loyalty to America was subjected to unjustified investigation because tattletales, encouraged by the American justice system, reported them to the Bureau of Investigation. And their Lutheran faith was regarded officially by our government as alien, seditious, anti-American, and a cover for terrorist activity. My German Lutheran ancestors were considered enemy aliens and automatically suspected of being spies, saboteurs, fifth columnists, slackers, and terrorists. We have no way of knowing how many other Lebanon families were affected after their beloved United States suspected them of being foreign terrorists. What we do know is that government propaganda was powerfully effective in turning American citizens against other American citizens. Government propaganda was powerfully effective in stirring religious bigotry. Government propaganda deprived American citizens of their civil rights.